Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the shadowy, often terrifying world of the Middle Ages, where superstition wasn't just a belief, it was a lethal reality. We're going to explore a time when a simple misunderstanding, a birthmark, or even just being a little too pretty could get you branded as a witch. You'll hear about the bizarre, the intimate, and the downright dangerous reasons you might have found yourself at the center of a witch trial. It's a world that feels so far away, but the echoes of its fear and intolerance still whisper through history. Just a heads up, you probably wouldn't have survived this era. Not with all your idiosyncrasies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and what time it is for you right now in the comments. I love seeing where you all are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You know, in the grand, messy tapestry of medieval life, one of the most dangerous things you could be was a woman. Not just any woman, but one who dared to step even slightly outside the expected, perfectly prescribed box of piety and domesticity. The era, let's be honest, wasn't exactly a golden age for female autonomy. It was a time when your very existence was filtered through a male-dominated lens, and any sign of a different kind of power, a power that wasn't tied to childbirth or prayer, was deeply, deeply suspicious. Our story, your story, begins with the concept of the witch. Forget the pointy hats and bubbling cauldrons for a moment. In the Middle Ages, the term witch was less of a job title and more of an accusation, a catch-all for anything that went wrong and couldn't be easily explained. A cow gives sour milk. Witchcraft. A child falls ill with a fever. A curse. Your husband, who you adore, suddenly loses his lust for you. Well, you might have been cursed, or perhaps a witch used a spell to bind him to her instead. This fear, this anxiety, it was everywhere. Let's talk about that last one for a moment, because the fear of witchcraft was often tied to the most intimate parts of life. The romance and physical love of the medieval period was a complicated affair. For a man, the inability to perform his marital duties was a deep source of shame and, often, a legitimate reason for a woman to petition for an annulment. But what if the problem wasn't him? What if it was you? Or, more specifically, what if a witch had cast a spell to prevent him from loving or, being intimate with you? The idea of a witch is not a physical charm or spell used to bind a man's affections or his ability to perform, was a very real and terrifying belief. Imagine your husband, who you've been with since you were both practically children, suddenly pulling away. He doesn't look at you the same, his touch feels cold, and the bed you once shared with warmth and affection now feels like a frozen lake. You'd be distraught, right? You'd seek answers. And in this era, the most likely answer wasn't "he's just stressed from the harvest," it was "a sorceress has bewitched him." And what if you were the one to blame? If your husband had a sudden, undeniable passion for another woman, the townsfolk might whisper that she had cast a love spell. These spells, often involving concoctions of strange herbs, animal parts, and whispered incantations, were considered one of the most common and dangerous forms of witchcraft. Historians still argue whether these love spells were ever truly believed to work or if they were simply a convenient excuse for men to stray and for communities to ostracize an inconveniently alluring woman. It's easy to see how a beautiful, independent woman who attracted male attention could quickly become the target of jealousy and suspicion. She didn't even have to do anything. Her very presence, her very allure, was enough to make her a danger. So, let's paint a picture of you, right now, in this medieval village. You're not a wicked crone, or a cackling villain. You're just you. You're perhaps a little more beautiful than the other girls. You've been known to turn a few heads at the market, and maybe you've even had a few secret admirers. But in this world, that's not a compliment. That's a target on your back. You're a young woman who, through no fault of your own, inspires desire in men, and because of this, you're feared. You're seen as a threat to the established order, to the sanctity of marriage and the peace of the community. It's a bit like being a pop star today, only instead of a record deal, the prize is a trip to the pyre. A quirky tidbit of the time is that some men, in a desperate attempt to break free from what they believed was a love spell, would literally go to a priest and ask for an exorcism. The poor guy probably just had a crush on someone new, but no, it had to be demons. This fear of forbidden love and strange intimacy was a huge part of the witch panic. It wasn't just about physical acts, but about the very essence of human connection. The church, of course, had its own view on all this. They preached that physical love was for procreation within the confines of marriage, and any other kind of passion, any other form of intimacy that was not sanctioned by God, was demonic. This created a fertile ground for suspicion. Any secret rendezvous, any whispered conversation in the shadows, could be twisted into something sinister. Imagine a young couple in love, meeting in secret, stealing a few precious moments away from prying eyes. What to them is a pure, secret romance, to a neighbor with a long memory and a suspicious mind, might look like a forbidden pact with the devil. And let's not forget the reverse side of that coin. What if you were a woman who didn't want to get married? Or what if you just enjoyed being on your own, liked your independence? That was even more dangerous. Your body, in this world, wasn't truly your own. It was a vessel for God's will, meant for procreation and to serve your husband. If you resisted that, if you chose to live alone, to be a maiden your entire life, you were defying God's will. You were seen as someone who was, and I love this phrase, unnatural. And the easiest explanation for something unnatural was, you guessed it, witchcraft. A mainstream historical fact is that the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, was a huge influence on this mindset. It was essentially a handbook for witch hunters, and it explicitly linked women's perceived sexual insatiability and lust to their susceptibility to the devil. It was a pretty grim and misogynistic piece of work, but it was also widely read and incredibly influential. It codified all of these vague fears into a set of rules and guidelines, making it even easier to accuse a woman of witchcraft. So, here you are, a woman navigating this dangerous world. Every glance, every gesture, every moment of intimacy or lack thereof is being scrutinized. Your beauty, your independence, your very nature, any of it could be the first domino to fall. It's a world of whispers and suspicion, where the most normal things can become the most dangerous. And it's only going to get weirder from here. The rain is falling softly outside your window, a gentle drumming on the thatch that's been a constant for days now. You're huddled by the fire, its warmth a small island in a sea of damp cold. You've just finished a poultice for old Master Fitzwilliam's cough, a blend of thyme, licorice root, and a touch of honey to soothe the throat. He came to you yesterday, a hacking, miserable mess, after the local physician, a pompous fellow with more Latin in his books than skill in his hands, had failed to help him. You didn't ask for payment, just a few eggs from his hens and the promise of a kind word or two. It's what you've always done. It's what your grandmother did, and her mother before her. You are, for lack of a better modern term, the village's apothecary. You're the one they come to when the cuts are deep, the fevers are high, and the children won't stop crying. But here's the rub, the bitter herb in your soothing tea, to the church and the authorities, you're not an apothecary. You're a cunning woman, and that's a slippery slope straight to being a witch. Your deep, intimate connection with nature, the one you've cultivated since you were a child, is viewed with suspicion. You know which moss will stop a wound from weeping, which root will ease a woman's childbirth pains, and which leaves, when brewed just so, will make a sick person sweat out a fever. You know the forest like the back of your hand, not just as a source of firewood, but as a living, breathing pharmacy. You treat it with respect, you speak to the plants as you gather them, and you thank the earth for its gifts. This, to some, isn't just knowledge. It's a pact. It's a subtle but dangerous shift in perception. Your grandmother taught you about the healing properties of yarrow, which, in fact, does have astringent qualities and can help stop bleeding. She taught you how to gather St. John's wort, an herb now known to have mild antidepressant properties. You use comfrey to help mend broken bones, not realizing you're employing a plant rich in allantoin, which promotes cell growth. To you, this is just science, in its most basic, earthy form. To the men in black robes, however, this is forbidden knowledge. The only true healing, they say, comes from God and his designated representatives, the priests and the physicians, who, incidentally, have a lot more formal education and a lot less hands-on experience than you do. Your cures, they'll argue, must be powered by a source other than God, and that source is almost always the devil. This fear was tied up in a deep suspicion of anything not officially sanctioned. The local doctor might have a fancy degree and a book full of complicated theories, but he'd often use techniques that were, to put it mildly, more dangerous than your herbal remedies. A common mainstream historical fact is the practice of bloodletting, where doctors would cut a patient to drain what they believed to be bad blood. It was a common, and often deadly, practice. You, with your simple poultices and calming teas, were probably a lot more effective. And that, paradoxically, made you even more dangerous in their eyes. Your success was a threat to their authority and their profits. So, when a patient gets better after you treat them and then dies a week later from something else entirely, it's not a coincidence. It's because you didn't just cure them, you made a deal for their soul. Your connection with nature extends to your little hut on the edge of the village. It's always a little messy, filled with hanging herbs drying from the rafters, jars of salves and potions, and the earthy, sweet smell of 1,000 different plants. Your neighbors, the ones you've helped, see it as a sanctuary. But to an outsider, to a traveling inquisitor or a zealous priest, it looks like a witch's cottage. The bundles of herbs are spells, the jars of strange liquids are poisons, and the very air, thick with the scent of nature, is tainted with dark magic. A quirky, almost humorous tidbit is how this suspicion extended to even the most mundane activities. You know how you love to gather mushrooms after a good rain? You know which ones are safe to eat and which ones will give you a terrible stomach ache, or worse. You're a mycologist, a forager. But in this era, a woman who knew the secrets of the fungi was a woman who knew how to make poisons, how to brew hallucinogenic potions, or how to speak with the spirits of the forest. The simple act of picking a mushroom could, in the right circumstances, be the first piece of evidence against you. The very act of caring for a sick neighbor with a simple, effective remedy, while a doctor failed to save another, made you more vulnerable to suspicion than the doctor himself. Historians still argue whether the medical establishment actively pushed the witch hunts to eliminate competition or if they simply exploited the existing superstitions to their own advantage. It's a chicken or egg scenario. Did the fear of witches lead to the discrediting of folk medicine, or did the desire to discredit folk medicine fuel the witch hunts? Either way, you, the woman who could heal a child with a compress of cool river mud and some willow bark, were a prime target. Your knowledge, your gentle touch, and your deep respect for the natural world were all twisted and weaponized against you. You weren't just a caregiver, you were a threat to a system that was built on fear, control, and the idea that all power, all knowledge, must flow from a single, approved source. So you're sitting there by the fire, your hands smelling of chamomile and sage, and you're completely unaware of the danger. You're simply being you, doing what you've always done. You're a woman of the earth, a healer, a protector. But the storm outside isn't just rain. It's a growing wave of suspicion and fear, and it's headed straight for your little cottage. The fire crackles a little too loudly, and you can't help but think about how the slightest sound now seems to carry more weight. It's not just the rain you hear. It's the whispers, the shifting glances, the way people now seem to cross the street just a little bit wider to avoid your path. It's a subtle but palpable change. And today, the source of a new, unsettling rumor has come to light. It started with little Martha, the miller's daughter, who was playing by the river and saw you wading in the shallows. Nothing unusual, you were just gathering some watercress. But what she saw, or what she claims she saw, was a strange, dark patch on your body. She pointed it out to her mother, and the rumor started to spread like a fever. The rumor, you see, is about a birthmark. Not just any birthmark, but a blemish, a mole, or a physical imperfection that could be interpreted as a devil's mark or a witch's teat. You have a small, irregularly shaped mole just below your left shoulder blade, one that's been there since you were born. Your mother used to call it a kiss from the fae, a sweet, fanciful notion that made you feel special. But in this new, paranoid world, it's not a kiss from a fairy. It's a brand from the devil. This is where the fear becomes intimately, physically real. The idea was that the devil, upon making a pact with a witch, would leave a physical mark on her body. This mark was said to be insensitive to pain and would not bleed when pricked. It was also believed to be a spot where a witch's familiar, we'll get to those later, would suckle. The mark itself didn't have to be anything exotic. It could be a mole, a wart, a scar, or even just a reddish patch of skin. The key was that it was unusual. And what's more unusual than a body that doesn't conform to the expected, perfect image of a devout Christian? This is where the whole thing becomes incredibly dangerous and personal. Your own body, the vessel you inhabit, becomes a weapon that can be used against you. A quirky tidbit of this particular horror is how the examination for these marks was carried out. It was usually done by a group of male inquisitors, often using a long, thin needle or pin. This was not a gentle, scientific examination. It was a terrifying, invasive procedure designed to find what they were already convinced was there. They would probe and poke at any blemish on your body, often with a theatrical flourish, to see if you would flinch or bleed. Of course, a person under extreme duress, possibly terrified and in pain, might not react as they expected. And if they found a spot that didn't bleed due to a naturally thick layer of skin or simply because of a mistake in their probing, it was taken as proof positive. A mainstream historical fact is that this belief in the physical mark was heavily influenced by the aforementioned Malleus Maleficarum. The book dedicated entire sections to how to find and identify these marks, giving detailed instructions on how to strip a person naked, shave their body, and search every inch of their skin for an imperfection. It was, in essence, a systematic, pseudoscientific approach to confirming a supernatural bias. And the more marks they found, the more certain they were of your guilt. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They weren't looking for an absence of a mark, they were looking for an excuse for a mark. This isn't just about the physical, though. It's also about the psychological torment. Imagine being stripped and prodded in front of a group of strangers, your every imperfection scrutinized and judged. The shame and humiliation alone would be enough to break a person. This was a form of physical and psychological torture designed not just to find a mark, but to make you feel like a sinner, to make you doubt your own innocence, and to ultimately force a confession. They didn't need a mark to prove you were a witch, they needed a mark to prove you were a sinner, a physical manifestation of your moral failing. Historians still argue whether the inquisitors truly believed in the literal devil's mark, or if it was simply another tool of coercion. Was it a genuine, superstitious belief, or was it a clever legal and psychological tactic to break a suspect? It's a difficult question to answer, but what's clear is that the fear of these marks was a very real and terrifying part of the witch hunts. Your body, which should be a source of strength and comfort, became a source of terror and vulnerability. So, here you are, a woman with a mole on her back. A harmless, insignificant dot of melanin that, in another time, would be nothing more than a part of you. But in this time, it's a target. It's a whispered word in the market, a pointed finger in the church, and a reason for the very people you have helped to turn against you. It's an intimate, personal betrayal, not just by your neighbors, but by your own flesh and blood. You remember that sweet, innocent feeling of your mother calling it a fey kiss. Now, you're starting to wonder if a kiss can sometimes be a brand. The whispers have a new target now. It's not just your body they're scrutinizing, but your mouth. You're a woman who speaks her mind. You're not rude, not mean-spirited, but you're not afraid to disagree, to challenge a man's poor decision, or to voice a different opinion. Remember that time old Thomas tried to plant his cabbages on the north-facing slope. You gently, but firmly, told him they'd never get enough sun there, and that the soil was too rocky. You were right, of course, and the crop failed miserably, just as you predicted. But what to you was simple common sense, to him, and to others who heard the story, was something else entirely. It was a sign of a sharp, unruly tongue. In this age of patriarchal dominance, a woman's role was to be seen and not heard, to be obedient and meek, to accept her lot in life with quiet piety. Your words, your clever observations, your ability to articulate a different perspective, all of this set you apart. And in a society that valued conformity above all else, being different was a very, very dangerous thing. When you pointed out Thomas's mistake, it wasn't just a farming tip, it was an act of defiance against a man's authority. You dared to suggest you knew better. And in their eyes, a woman who knows better than a man must have gotten her knowledge from a source other than God. You didn't just have a quick wit, you had a witch's tongue. The fear of a woman's words was deeply ingrained in the culture. Proverbs and religious texts warned against the gossiping, meddling woman. Her voice was seen as a potential source of discord and sin. So when you, with your clear, logical arguments, dared to stand up for yourself or for someone else, you weren't just speaking. You were performing a kind of magic, a manipulation of reality through speech. You were using your words not to soothe and comfort, as a proper woman should, but to challenge and to disrupt. A mainstream historical fact is that accusations of witchcraft were often born from personal disputes. A neighborly disagreement, a squabble over land, or a perceived slight could escalate into an accusation. If you had a reputation for being argumentative or difficult, you were a prime candidate for this kind of revenge. The miller's wife might have been jealous of your friendship with the baker's wife, and after a particularly heated argument about the quality of flour, she might start a rumor that your sharp words were a curse. You didn't just tell her to be quiet, you silenced her with magic. It's a ridiculous, but terrifyingly effective, line of reasoning. This fear also extended to the idea of cursing. A simple angry outburst, a frustration-fueled, "I hope your crops rot in the field," could be taken as a literal curse. If, by some coincidence, that person's crops did fail, you would be held responsible. Your words, once spoken, were believed to have the power to alter the very fabric of reality. You were a walking, talking weapon, and the only way to disarm you was to silence you for good. A quirky, almost sad tidbit is how this affected the way women communicated with each other. They learned to be careful, to be indirect, to use coded language and gestures to express themselves. The fear of being overheard, of having a simple complaint twisted into a curse, created a climate of suspicion even among friends. You could no longer vent your frustrations freely. Every word had to be weighed and measured, every sentiment carefully edited before it left your lips. It was a kind of psychological prison, and the key was a fear of your own voice. Historians still argue whether this fear of a woman's tongue was a genuine supernatural belief or simply a powerful tool of social control. Was it about a real fear of curses, or was it a way to enforce patriarchal norms and keep women in their place? It's likely a bit of both. The belief in curses provided the pretext, and the desire for control provided the motivation. So here you are, a woman with a quick mind and a ready tongue, and you're learning a terrible lesson. That the freedom to speak, a right we take for granted today, was a luxury you couldn't afford. Your intelligence, your independence, and your very voice have become the latest evidence against you. The silence of the village, once a sign of peace, now feels like a collective holding of its breath, just waiting for you to say the wrong thing. The air in your cottage feels heavy tonight, a different kind of heavy than the rain and the cold. It's the weight of watchful eyes, of judgments already made. But you're not entirely alone. Curled up by the hearth is a small, black cat, purring so loudly it's almost a comfort. You found him as a kitten, skinny and shivering in a drainage ditch after a terrible storm. You took him in, fed him milk, and named him Shadow. He's your constant companion, a warm little friend who chases mice and sleeps at the foot of your bed. He's just a cat, right? Not in this world. In this world, your cat isn't just a cat. He's a familiar, a demonic spirit in animal form, sent by the devil himself to aid you in your wicked deeds. Your bond with him, the simple, quiet affection you share, is twisted into something perverse and unholy. The fact that he's black, a color often associated with darkness and evil, is just another piece of the damning evidence. Every time you pet him, every time he rubs against your leg, every time he catches a mouse and leaves it as a gift, you are, in their eyes, communicating with the forces of hell. This belief in familiars was a core component of witch accusations. These spirits were thought to take the form of common animals, cats, dogs, toads, even spiders, and serve their master, the witch, in exchange for a small amount of her blood or soul. The witch's teat we talked about earlier. That's where the familiar was supposed to suckle, feeding off her unnatural life force. So, your little Shadow, with his gentle purr and soft fur, is now seen as a monstrous, otherworldly creature. A little cat that you saved and love is now the physical manifestation of your demonic pact. A mainstream historical fact is that the most common animals accused of being familiars were cats, largely due to their independent nature and nocturnal habits. They were also associated with ancient pagan deities and rituals, a link that the church was keen to exploit. This fear led to a widespread slaughter of cats across Europe, a purge that, ironically, led to a boom in the rat population, which in turn contributed to the spread of the Black Death. A fun, but utterly grim, consequence of mass hysteria. But it's not just the cat. Maybe you have an owl that sometimes perches on your windowsill, its hoots a familiar sound in the evening. Or perhaps you've tamed a wild squirrel that comes to your hand for nuts. The more unusual the animal, the more powerful the supposed familiar. A toad, for instance, was seen as a particularly potent familiar, associated with poisons and curses. Your simple love for a creature, your willingness to care for a being that others might shun, becomes proof of a deeper, more sinister connection. It's a sad irony that the very qualities that make you a kind and compassionate person are now being used to brand you as a villain. A quirky tidbit of this particular terror is that the familiars were often given whimsical, almost silly names. Names like Grizzle or Pewkit, which, when spoken in the solemn tones of a witch trial, must have sounded completely absurd. It's this blend of the mundane and the terrifying, of a silly name and a serious accusation, that really shows the absurdity of the whole situation. You're being accused of consorting with a demon named, essentially, Fluffy. Historians still argue about the true origin of the familiar concept. Was it a genuine folkloric belief that was later co-opted by the church? Or was it an invention of the witch hunters to give a physical form to their accusations? It's likely a mix of both, but what's clear is that the idea of the familiar gave the accusers a tangible, visible piece of evidence. They could point to your cat and say, there is the proof of her evil. They didn't need to understand the bond you shared with your animal. They just needed to see it, and twist it to fit their narrative. So you reach down and stroke Shadow's soft fur, his purr a small, defiant rumble against the silence of the night. You know he's just a cat. But the world outside your window has decided otherwise. They've decided he's the devil in a fur coat, and your simple act of love is the most dangerous kind of magic. A chill has seeped into your cottage, not just from the weather, but from the fear that hangs in the air. This morning, you woke to a terrible sound, the wailing of a mother. Young Thomas, the baker's son, has been struck down with a fever. He's delirious, his skin burning to the touch, and the village physician is at a loss. He's tried his usual concoctions, his prayers, his bloodletting, nothing has worked. Now, with a child's life hanging in the balance, the whispers are turning to you. They're asking a terrifying question: was it a curse? This is the great, terrifying power of witchcraft accusations in the Middle Ages. They provided a simple, albeit horrifying, explanation for the unexplainable. Sickness, particularly sudden or mysterious sickness, was a prime candidate. In a world with a very limited understanding of germs, viruses, and diseases, the unexplained illness of a child or a beloved elder had to have a supernatural cause. It couldn't be a random misfortune, a simple biological accident. No, it had to be the work of malicious magic. And you, with your knowledge of herbs and your unusual cat, are the perfect scapegoat. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the so-called witches were healers and midwives. These women, with their practical knowledge of the human body and natural remedies, were often the first line of defense against illness in their communities. But when one of their remedies failed, or when a patient died from a disease they couldn't possibly cure, that same knowledge became a weapon against them. The trust they had built over a lifetime of service could evaporate in an instant, replaced by a deep-seated fear. The same hands that delivered a baby into the world could, in the eyes of a terrified community, be the same hands that cursed a child with a fever. Imagine the scene at the baker's house. A crowd has gathered, their faces a mix of grief and rage. The baker's wife, your friend, is inconsolable. And in their sorrow and confusion, they're looking for someone to blame. The priest is there, speaking in hushed tones about the work of the devil. The physician, humbled by his failure, is eager to shift the blame to a supernatural source rather than admit his own incompetence. All eyes, and all fingers, are pointing in one direction: your cottage on the edge of the village. The fact that you've successfully cured dozens of people over the years is forgotten. The one time a child falls ill and you're not there to help, or your help isn't sought, or the disease is simply too powerful, that's all that matters. Your failure to save a child becomes proof that you had the power to harm him all along. A quirky, almost cruel, tidbit is how this played out in the legal system. A key part of the witch trials was the concept of the malignant eye, or the evil eye. It was believed that a witch could curse a person or an animal just by looking at them. So, if you happened to be in the marketplace and glanced in the direction of the baker's son just before he fell ill, that simple, innocent act could be twisted into a curse. It didn't matter what your intentions were. The act of looking, a fundamental part of human interaction, was weaponized. You couldn't even meet someone's gaze without risking an accusation. Historians still argue whether the accusations were a genuine expression of a community's grief and fear, or if they were a convenient tool for the authorities to maintain social order and control. Was it a real, supernatural panic? Or was it a way to police dissent, to silence those who didn't conform, and to remove social outcasts? The answer, as is often the case with history, is probably a combination of all of the above. The fear was real, but the methods used to exploit that fear were very much a product of a power-hungry and deeply patriarchal society. So you sit by your hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, and you listen. You hear the growing chorus of angry voices, a tide of fear and suspicion that is building against your door. You didn't do anything. You couldn't have done anything. But in this world, that doesn't matter. Your guilt isn't based on your actions, it's based on their fear. The illness of a child, a tragedy you have no power over, has become the final piece of the puzzle. And it's a puzzle they've been assembling for a long, long time. The rain has stopped, but the gloom hasn't lifted. You're sitting by the fire, your cat, Shadow, curled in your lap, purring a rhythmic, soothing drone. You're holding a small, leather-bound book, its pages worn and softened with age. It's not a book of spells or incantations, but a collection of folk songs, proverbs, and remedies, passed down through your family. Your grandmother taught you to read from this book, and her mother taught her. The words on the page are a comfort to you, a connection to the women who came before you, a link to a time before this fear took hold. But to the world outside your cottage, this book isn't a family heirloom. It's a grimoire, a book of forbidden knowledge, a physical manifestation of your pact with the devil. And the fact that you, a woman, can read it at all is another damning piece of evidence. In the Middle Ages, literacy was a rare and precious skill, largely reserved for priests, monks, and wealthy merchants. For a woman, especially one who lived on the edge of the village and practiced folk medicine, being able to read was not seen as an accomplishment. It was seen as suspicious. This fear of female literacy was deeply rooted in the belief that women were more susceptible to temptation and sin. A woman who could read, especially a woman who could read something other than the Bible, was a woman who could be easily swayed by the devil's words. She could read forbidden texts, learn dangerous secrets, and, most importantly, she could think for herself. A woman who could read was a woman who had a mind of her own, and that was a very dangerous thing indeed. Your simple, loving act of reading to yourself by the fire is, in their eyes, an act of rebellion. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were illiterate. The Church had a monopoly on knowledge, and the ability to read and interpret sacred texts was a source of immense power. When a layperson, especially a woman, gained this power, it was seen as a direct challenge to the authority of the Church and the social order. You weren't just reading. You were encroaching on a male-dominated, sacred space. This suspicion extended beyond just books. Maybe you're a talented embroiderer, weaving intricate patterns into your cloth. To you, it's a creative outlet, a way to pass the long winter nights. But to a paranoid mind, those patterns could be secret symbols, a hidden language, or a coded message to your familiar. A quirky tidbit is that some accused witches were even said to have a secret knowledge of astronomy, using the stars not to navigate, but to cast spells and predict the future. Your simple love of the night sky, your quiet contemplation of the constellations, could be twisted into a demonic act. Your pursuit of knowledge, in any form, was an act of defiance. Historians still argue whether the suppression of female literacy was a deliberate, organized effort by the Church or if it was a more organic consequence of a deeply misogynistic society. Was the fear of the witch a clever pretext to keep women uneducated and powerless? Or was the fear of an educated woman a genuine, superstitious fear? It's a complex question, but the result was the same. Your knowledge, your curiosity, your very ability to learn and think, became a liability. So you close the book, its worn leather a cold comfort against your palm. You place it carefully on a shelf, hiding it beneath a pile of dried herbs. it's a small, sad act of self-preservation. You're not just hiding a book, you're hiding a part of yourself. You're hiding your intellect, your history, your connection to the women who came before you. The whispers outside are getting louder, and you know, with a heavy heart, that they will not be silenced by reason or logic. They are fueled by fear, and your mind, your beautiful, curious, literate mind, is their next target. The darkness outside your window is absolute, and the silence is punctuated only by the low rumble of the wind. Your small cottage feels both like a sanctuary and a prison. The whispers of the villagers, now fueled by the accusation of the baker's son's illness, have grown into a roar you can no longer ignore. You're a woman alone, and in this world, that's a crime in and of itself. You live without a husband, without a father or a brother to protect you. You own your own small plot of land, you tend to your own garden, and you manage your own affairs. You are, in essence, a woman with no man to answer to, and that makes you a dangerous anomaly. This is a deep-seated fear in medieval society. The social structure was built around the family unit, with a man at its head. A woman's identity was defined by her relationship to a man. She was a daughter, a wife, a widow. If you were none of these things, or if you were a widow who chose not to remarry and instead managed your own life, you were an outlier. You were a woman who possessed a kind of autonomy that was deeply threatening to the patriarchal order. The fear was that a woman who could live and thrive on her own must have a secret source of power, and that source, as always, was assumed to be demonic. This is about more than just social status, it's about control. A mainstream historical fact is that unmarried women and widows who owned property were often the targets of witch hunts. The accusations, in many cases, were a convenient way for a community to seize a woman's land and assets. You, with your little cottage and your well-tended garden, are a perfect example. You've made your living by your own wits and your own hands, and in a world where everything is owned by men, that makes you a target. Your independence isn't a virtue, it's a provocation. A quirky tidbit of this particular horror is that the fear of the independent woman was so strong that even a woman who was married but had a difficult relationship with her husband could be accused. If you were a woman who spoke back, who didn't obey, or who had a reputation for being headstrong, your husband might accuse you of being a witch to gain control over you or to simply get rid of you. The witch hunt, in many ways, was the ultimate tool for domestic oppression. Your refusal to be meek and subservient wasn't just a personality trait, it was evidence of your demonic nature. Historians still argue whether the economic motive, the desire for a woman's land and property, was the primary driver of the witch hunts or if it was a secondary consequence of genuine religious and social fear. Was it a calculated, greedy act, or was it a horrifying side effect of a panicked society? The truth, as is often the case, is likely a blend of both. The fear provided the pretext, and the economic benefit provided the motivation. So you sit in your cottage, alone. You're not lonely, you have your memories, your knowledge, your books, and your cat. But you are alone in the eyes of the village, and that is a dangerous, unforgivable sin. The very air you breathe, the food you grow, the roof over your head, all of it is a product of your own labor, and all of it is being eyed by your neighbors with a mixture of envy and suspicion. You are a woman who walks her own path, and in this world, there's only one place that path can lead. The silence of your cottage is a fragile thing. It's a quiet that's been broken by 1,000 tiny judgments and whispers, and now, by the low, angry hum of a crowd forming outside. They're no longer just talking. They're coming for you. And the final piece of their twisted puzzle isn't about your body or your knowledge, but about your behavior. You've always been a bit of a solitary person, a bit of an eccentric. You prefer the company of your cat and your books to the boisterous, often cruel, gossip of the tavern. You have your own little routines, your own little rituals. You like to walk in the woods at dawn, you like to hum to yourself as you tend your garden, and you sometimes speak to the animals you encounter? To you, this is just you. But to the villagers, these are not harmless quirks. They are strange rituals and evidence of a social outcast's pact with the devil. Your solitary nature is seen as a sign of your rejection of God and His community. Your quiet walks in the woods aren't for contemplation, they're for meeting with your familiar or for gathering forbidden ingredients. Your humming isn't a song, it's an incantation. And your gentle talk to the animals isn't kindness, it's a way of commanding the spirits that reside within them. Every little thing that makes you you is twisted into a sign of your demonic alliance. The pressure to conform in a medieval village was immense. Your social life was the church, the market, and the hearths of your neighbors. If you chose to opt out of that, for any reason, you were immediately under suspicion. This is a mainstream historical fact. Social isolation was a major factor in which accusations. The otherness of a person, whether it was due to a physical deformity, a different religious belief, or simply a refusal to participate in community life, was a powerful motivator for suspicion. You weren't just a quiet person. You were a woman who actively rejected your community, and that rejection was seen as a rejection of God. A quirky tidbit of this particular fear is how it extended to even the most mundane of habits. If you had a strange way of holding your knife, or if you ate your food in an unusual order, it could be seen as a secret ritual. Your personal habits, the little things you do without thinking, were all being watched and judged. The line between eccentricity and evil was razor thin, and the villagers were all too happy to push you over it. Your uniqueness, which in another time might have been celebrated, was now your greatest vulnerability. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were a way of punishing social outcasts or if social outcasts were simply more vulnerable to being accused in a climate of genuine supernatural fear. Was the goal to remove the undesirables from society, or was it a horrifying consequence of a society that couldn't tolerate difference? It's a complex question, but the result was the same. Your quiet life, your solitary nature, and your gentle habits were all twisted into something dark and dangerous. The crowd outside is growing louder now. You can hear individual voices in the din, and they're shouting your name. They're not shouting in anger, not yet. It's a kind of fearful, self-righteous certainty. They found their explanation for all the bad things in their lives, and you, with your strange rituals and your quiet ways, are it. You were never just a woman living her life. You were always, in their eyes, a threat. And now, they've come to neutralize it. The sound of the crowd is no longer a hum, it's a terrifying, percussive pounding on your cottage door. You hear shouts, but not of anger, not yet. It's the sound of righteous fury, of a mob convinced they are doing God's work. And you know, with a sickening certainty, who is at the heart of this. It's your neighbor, old Bess. Not the gentle, kind woman you've always known, but a woman with a grievance. Just last week, you had a small disagreement over a stray chicken that had been scratching up your garden. You'd had words, sharp and a little unkind on both sides. To you, it was a simple, petty disagreement between neighbors. To her, it was an affront, an unholy insult from a woman she already distrusted. This is the great, terrible tragedy of the witch hunts. They weren't always started by a zealous priest or a grand inquisitor. They often began with a simple, personal dispute. A mainstream historical fact is that personal grudges and feuds were a leading cause of witchcraft accusations. Your neighbor's cow stopped giving milk, your child's fever grew worse, your husband suddenly lost his love for you. In a world with no real legal recourse for these kinds of problems, the accusation of witchcraft became a powerful tool of revenge. It was a way to settle scores, to get rid of a troublesome neighbor, and to justify your own misfortunes by blaming an enemy. Your argument with Bess wasn't just a moment of petty frustration, it was the final, fatal spark. The psychology of this is fascinating and terrifying. The person making the accusation, your neighbor, may not have even consciously believed you were a witch at first. Perhaps she was just angry and hurt. But once the seed was planted, once the words were spoken, the fear took root. The other villagers, who already harbored their own suspicions about you, latched onto it. Your unruly tongue when you spoke to Thomas, your unusual mole, your knowledge of herbs, your unmarried state, all of it suddenly made sense through the lens of Bess's accusation. She didn't just accuse you, she gave a framework for everyone else's fears. She provided the casus belli, the justification for their paranoia. A quirky, and frankly cruel, tidbit is how often these accusations were made by a person who was in a position of power over the accused, or who was in a state of distress. A grieving parent, a jealous spouse, a disgruntled neighbor, these were the people who, in their moment of pain or anger, would point a finger and say, "It was her." The act of accusing someone of witchcraft was a way of externalizing your own problems, of turning your pain into someone else's guilt. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were a top-down phenomenon, driven by the church and state, or a bottom-up one, driven by community paranoia and personal grievances. Was the mob outside your door acting on their own fears, or were they being manipulated by a higher power? The truth, as is often the case, is a terrifying mix of both. The fear was real, but the system that allowed that fear to be weaponized was already in place. The pounding on your door grows louder, more insistent. You can hear Bess's voice now, a high, thin wail of anger and self-pity. She's not just your neighbor anymore. She's the instrument of your destruction. The stray chicken, the argument, the sharp words you both said, all of it has been twisted and contorted into a monstrous lie. You didn't just disagree with her, you cursed her. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you used your demonic power to harm her. The trust and camaraderie of a community, the very things that should have protected you, have been turned into the sharpest, most deadly weapons imaginable. The pounding on the door has stopped, replaced by a new, more sinister sound, the scraping of a heavy object being dragged across the ground. You know, without needing to see it, that they're bringing a ram. The silence of the crowd is now broken by a chilling murmur, a low tide of collective anticipation. This isn't just a personal feud anymore. The anger and accusations of a single neighbor, Bess, have been amplified 100-fold by the village's deep-seated hysteria. The air is thick with the power of suggestion, a psychological force more dangerous than any pitchfork or torch. The fear of you, the witch, has become a real and tangible thing, and it has infected the entire community like a plague. This is a key part of the witch hunt phenomenon, a mainstream historical fact that's both fascinating and terrifying. The witch hunts weren't just about the accused, they were about the accusers. The collective fear of the unknown, of plague, of famine, of bad harvests, of all the things that medieval people couldn't control, needed a release valve. And the witch was the perfect target. Your misfortunes, your disagreements, your unusual behavior, all of it was woven into a grand, terrifying narrative that gave the villagers a sense of control over their chaotic world. By blaming you for everything that went wrong, they could restore order to their own lives. You became the physical embodiment of all their anxieties and all their misfortunes. The mob outside your door isn't just angry, they're terrified, and that terror makes them incredibly dangerous. The power of suggestion was a potent weapon. A single accusation, a single pointed finger, could set off a chain reaction of fear. The neighbors who were once friendly now look at you with suspicion. The children you once helped now point at you and whisper. The smallest misfortune, a spilled bucket of milk, a scraped knee, a bad dream, is now attributed to your curse. It's a classic case of mass hysteria, where a shared delusion becomes a shared reality. A quirky tidbit is how this played out in the courtroom. Sometimes, a witch would be asked to touch a person she was said to have cursed. If the person's symptoms worsened, it was proof of guilt. But if they improved, it was also proof of guilt, as the witch was said to be hiding her power. It was a lose-lose situation, a perfect example of how an entire system could be built on a foundation of illogical, fear-based reasoning. Historians still argue whether mass hysteria was the primary cause of the witch hunts, or if it was simply a useful tool to justify them. Was the fear a genuine, supernatural panic, or was it a form of social control? The truth, as is often the case, is a chilling blend of both. The fear was real, but the methods used to stoke that fear were deliberate and powerful. The sound of the ram hitting the door is a deafening crash. The flimsy wood splinters, and the door groans in protest. The mob, their faces a sea of twisted, fear-filled masks, is there. You look into their eyes, and you see not just anger, but a profound, desperate terror. They are not coming for you out of malice. They are coming for you because they are scared. And in this moment, you realize that fear is the most dangerous kind of magic there is. The door splinters inward with a final, violent crash, and the mob surges into your cottage, their faces contorted with a mix of fear and self-righteousness. They grab you, their hands rough and cold, and drag you out into the night. The journey to the village square is a nightmare of pushing, pulling, and shouted accusations. When you finally arrive, you're thrown to the ground in front of a makeshift court, presided over by the local priest and a few of the more prominent townsmen. Their eyes are cold, devoid of the kindness you once knew. You're no longer the village healer, you're the accused. The first order of business, you're told, is the physical examination. They need to find the witch's mark, the physical proof of your demonic pact. Your clothes are torn from you, and you're left shivering in the cold night air. The priest, his face grim, explains that the devil leaves a mark on his servants, a spot where their skin is insensitive to pain and does not bleed. This is where the terror becomes real, a bone-deep certainty that no amount of protest or truth will save you. They have a tool for this, a long, thin needle, a witch pricker, and their intent is to find what they're already convinced is there. A mainstream historical fact is that this pricking was a common and terrifying practice in witch trials. It was a form of legalized torture designed to elicit a confession. The pricker would probe every blemish on your body, moles, warts, scars, even freckles, with the needle. The person wielding the needle might even have a retractable tip, so that no matter how hard they pressed, it would appear that the flesh was not being pierced, thus proving that the spot was insensitive to pain. They would then point to your lack of reaction, the absence of blood, and declare it a mark of the devil. Your fear, your shock, your pain, all of it would be twisted against you. The process was deeply humiliating and invasive. Your body, which had been a source of comfort and strength, was now a source of shame and vulnerability. It was a final, devastating act of stripping away your humanity. A quirky tidbit of this horror is that some prickers would even use dull needles, or deliberately miss the spot they were aiming for, to guarantee a positive result. They weren't looking for the truth, they were looking for a conviction. The very act of the examination was a foregone conclusion. You were guilty before they even began. Historians still argue whether the prickers themselves believed in their work or if they were simply cynical torturers for hire. Was the belief in the witch's mark a genuine superstition, or was it a convenient tool for judicial murder? The evidence suggests a combination of both. The fear was real, but the methods used to exploit that fear were calculated and cruel. So you stand there, shivering, your skin a canvas for their accusations. They poke and prod, their faces a mix of disgust and fascination. And when they finally land on that little mole on your left shoulder blade, the one your mother called a kiss from the fae, they press the needle in. You don't cry out. You're too numb, too broken by this horrifying act. And when they pull the needle out, and the skin doesn't bleed, a triumphant roar goes up from the crowd. They found it. They found the proof. They found the devil's mark. And in that moment, you know, with a certainty that chills you to your bones, that it doesn't matter what you say or what you do. You are already condemned. You're huddled in a cold, damp cell, the stone walls seeping with moisture, the straw on the floor a scratchy, miserable bed. The sounds of the village are muffled, but you can still hear the distant shouts, the low murmurs, the constant hum of a community that has turned on itself. You close your eyes, but the images of the past few hours, the angry faces, the cold needle, the triumphant roar of the crowd, are burned into your mind. You know, with a terrible certainty, what they're whispering about now. They're talking about the witches' Sabbath. This is where the collective hysteria and personal grudges all coalesce into a grand, terrifying, and completely imaginary narrative. The witches' Sabbath was a cornerstone of the witch trials, a fantastical belief that witches would gather in secret, unholy meetings to worship the devil and engage in all manner of debauchery and evil. This wasn't just a simple meeting, it was a perversion of a religious ceremony, a dark mirror of the Christian Mass. You were said to have flown there on brooms or with the aid of your familiar, to have signed a pact in blood, and to have feasted on the bodies of the unbaptized. A mainstream historical fact is that the belief in the witches' Sabbath was largely a product of the late medieval and early modern period, heavily influenced by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum and the imaginations of the inquisitors themselves. They needed to believe in a grand, organized conspiracy of evil to justify the scale of the hunts. The idea of a single, isolated witch was scary, but the idea of an entire army of them, meeting in secret to plot the downfall of Christianity, was a justification for mass murder. A quirky tidbit of this particular fantasy is how detailed the descriptions of the Sabbaths were. The accused, under torture, would often confess to things they'd read or heard about in local folklore, things like dancing naked in a circle, eating strange foods, and having sexual relations with the devil, who was often said to appear in the form of a goat or a man with horns. These confessions, of course, were not the result of a supernatural meeting, but a direct consequence of extreme duress and the vivid imaginations of their interrogators. Historians still argue about the origins of the Sabbath myth. Was it a complete fabrication by the inquisitors to create a more compelling narrative? Or was it based on existing pagan rituals, which were then demonized and twisted to fit the church's agenda? It's a complex and difficult question, but what's clear is that the idea of the Sabbath was a powerful tool of social control. It created a sense of external threat, a powerful enemy that the community could unite against. The fear wasn't just about a woman with a strange cat, it was about a hidden, evil force in their midst, and you, the woman in the cold, damp cell, were the key to unlocking the whole conspiracy. So you lie there, shivering, and you know they're talking about you. They're talking about the crimes you supposedly committed in a forest you've never been to, with a man you've never met. They're talking about your pact, your familiar, and your evil deeds. And in the face of this kind of collective delusion, your truth, your reality, the gentle, kind life you lived, all of it is completely irrelevant. They have a story they need to tell, and you, with your unconventional life and your quiet ways, are the perfect villain. The iron bars of your cell are cold and unforgiving. A guard brings you a meager meal, his eyes avoiding yours, and you know the trial is about to begin. The trial, what a strange word for this grotesque charade. You're not being tried, you're being ritually condemned. This is a crucial, terrifying part of the process, the final act in their play. The goal isn't to determine your innocence or guilt, but to extract a confession. The trial itself is a spectacle of power and control, a performance for the terrified masses. A mainstream historical fact is that a confession was considered the gold standard of evidence in a witch trial. The belief was that a witch's pact with the devil was a secret, and only a confession, willingly given or otherwise, could reveal the full extent of the evil. To get that confession, they would employ a variety of methods, all of which fall under the umbrella of torture. You would be questioned for hours, deprived of sleep, food, and water. You'd be shown the instruments of their trade, the thumbscrews, the rack, the strappado, and told that a confession would spare you from their use. This wasn't about finding the truth, it was about breaking you. The psychological toll of this is almost impossible to imagine. You would be interrogated by men who were absolutely convinced of your guilt. They would twist your words, misinterpret your every glance, and use your own life story against you. The things you did, the places you went, the people you knew, all of it would be recontextualized as evidence of your demonic pact. Your family history of healing, your solitary nature, your love for your cat, all of it would be brought up in the courtroom as proof of your evil. The trial was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, designed to make you doubt your own memories, to make you believe that maybe, just maybe, they were right. A quirky tidbit of this particular horror is that the confessions were often incredibly detailed and imaginative, filled with fantastical stories of flying to the witch's sabbath and having intimate relations with the devil. This wasn't because the witches were telling the truth, but because they were often coached by their interrogators, who wanted to hear certain stories to confirm their own beliefs. They would ask leading questions, and the accused, in a state of physical and emotional agony, would give them the answers they wanted to hear. The confessions were a terrifying blend of folklore, fear, and a desperate desire for the pain to stop. Historians still argue whether the confessions were a genuine expression of religious belief or a clever tool of coercion. Was the Inquisitor truly trying to save your soul by getting you to confess, or was he simply trying to gain a conviction? It's a chilling thought that both could be true. He could genuinely believe he was saving you from an eternity in hell by forcing a confession, and in doing so, could justify the most horrific of acts. The guard leads you from your cell and into the courtroom. The room is packed with people, their faces a sea of morbid curiosity and fearful self-righteousness. You are placed in a chair in the center of the room, and the priest begins to read the list of your crimes. They aren't your crimes, of course. They are the village's fears, written in a book. And as he reads, you realize with a cold, hollow certainty, that the only way out of this is to give them what they want. You are not on trial for being a witch, you are on trial for failing to confess. And in this terrifying world, a confession is the only thing that can save you. You confessed. You told them what they wanted to hear. You spoke of the black mass in the forest, of a pact with a horned figure, of the names of other women you saw there. Lies, all of it, born of pain and fear and a desperate, final, terrible hope for an end to the torment. They recorded every word, their faces a mix of grim satisfaction and unholy triumph. Your confession, coerced and false, was the final piece of their proof, the final justification for their actions. You signed the document, your hand shaking, and you knew, with a certainty that chilled you to the bone, that you were no longer just a woman. You were a witch. And then, it all just stopped. It didn't stop for you, of course. For you, the end was swift and brutal. But over the next few centuries, the witch hunts began to decline. The flames of hysteria, which had consumed so much of Europe, began to flicker and die. This is the last, and perhaps most important, part of our story. The end of an era. The slow, painful, and often illogical decline of the witch craze. A mainstream historical fact is that the witch hunts were largely over by the mid-18th century. The reasons for this decline are complex and still debated by historians. One of the major factors was the rise of scientific rationalism and the Enlightenment. People began to question the supernatural explanations for things like disease and crop failure. The rise of a more reasoned, evidence-based approach to the world made the fantastical claims of the witch trials seem more and more absurd. The old certainties, the old fears, began to give way to new ones, based on reason and logic rather than superstition and dogma. A quirky, and somewhat ironic, tidbit is that the very methods used in the witch trials helped to bring about their downfall. The widespread use of torture and the fantastical nature of the confessions began to breed skepticism, even among the accusers themselves. People started to question why the confessions were always so similar, and why the accused, under duress, would confess to things that were clearly impossible. The absurdity of it all, the sheer volume of confessions that described the same events, eventually became a source of doubt rather than a source of proof. The system that was built on a foundation of fear and superstition ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own illogicality. Historians still argue whether the decline of the witch hunts was a triumph of reason over superstition, or if it was simply a change in the way society dealt with its anxieties and social outcasts. Did we truly get smarter, or did we just find new ways to persecute the vulnerable? It's a chilling question, and the answer is probably a bit of both. We stopped burning witches, but we didn't stop persecuting those who were different. We simply found new, more rational names for our prejudices. So you lie here, a ghost in this bed, a memory in the long, dark history of the world. You were a woman, a healer, a friend, a neighbor. You were also a victim of fear, of superstition, of personal grudges and a collective insanity that gripped the world for centuries. Your story, though it has a terrible end, is a reminder that the most dangerous magic of all is not the kind that lives in the forest or in a book of shadows. It is the kind that lives in the hearts of men, a magic born of fear and ignorance, a magic that can turn a kind neighbor into a terrified mob. The room is silent now. The fire has died down to a few glowing embers. The fan in the corner hums a soft, sleepy tune. The whispers are gone. The cold is gone. All that remains is the darkness, a comforting, peaceful darkness that wraps around you like a soft blanket. The ghosts of this story, the witches and the inquisitors, are all just that now, ghosts. It's time for you to let them go. The journey is over. There is only rest. Good night, sweet dreams.